A warm welcome to our listeners. This is SciLang Global Podcast, where polyglots from around the world help us unravel the relationship between languages, science, and ourselves. My name is Agnieszka, and today I have the pleasure of hosting our guest. Dr. Thomas Bong is reader in psychology at the University of Edinburgh, clinical research fellow in the Center for Clinical Brain Sciences, and program director of Bilingualism Matters. Thomas's work focuses on cognitive effects of bilingualism and language learning. So grab something nice to drink and let's begin. Hello, Thomas. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
I think I'll start with a question that I always start, actually. So I wanted to ask you about languages that you speak. Can you list them for us and tell us a little bit why you chose to learn these languages, or what happened in your life that made you know these languages?
Well, it's always, I would say, the more languages one speaks, the more difficult the question becomes. Not only because there are more of them, but also because it's a different level, different context, and so on. So I find it a little bit like a question if you asked me, how many friends do you have? Well, now, for instance, as you will know, for instance, in Polish, we have the word przyjaciel, which usually means much more a close friend. So no one would say that they have probably 560 przyjaciół. But if I go into the English friend, which is almost anybody I can, tell the name of, then of course, on Facebook, I will have probably, many hundreds. So I would say it's a kind of little bit different, similar situation with languages. So my first language with which I practically grew up was Polish. I was born in Krakow and grew up speaking Polish. But in a way, that already the start of the story, because in a way it was a lost opportunity. Because my mother was in fact a native German speaker. She was from Silesia, from Śląsk, and her first language was in fact German. And my father spoke very good German. Krakow was, as you will know, part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. My grandfather studied in Vienna. So German would have been the lingua franca of all the people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire who spoke very different languages, Polish, Czech, Slovak, but also Hungarian, Romanian, languages which had absolutely nothing, so to say, no similarities. So German was still, in the generation of my father, the kind of general language of communication between those different ethnic groups. So I could have grown up speaking both languages, but at that time, the idea was that it could be dangerous for children. In fact, the idea all over the world. Only much later I learned that around the time when I was growing up in Krakow in the 60s, researchers in Montreal started question the idea that bilingual education is dangerous, and in fact suggested, Lambert and Peel studies suggested that in fact it's exactly the opposite. So from this point of view, I heard German because my parents were speaking German when they wanted to exclude me from the conversation, which in a way is possibly a good way to make a child interested in languages, because I realize if I know a language, I will understand things that people are trying to hide from me.
The forbidden fruit.
Exactly. So from this point of view, maybe it was not such a bad thing, because, as I say, it made me very curious about languages. And then with 17, I moved to Germany, so I had to learn German. And I already did my A-level exam in Germany, studied there. I have family there. So in a way, it's a language which I'm very, very familiar with. And often when I think intensely and try to think about the concept, the word comes first to me in German, which I think could also be the case because it's a very precise language. So already there, you will find a little bit of a kind of emotional distinction, and that Polish was for me much more the kind of language of feelings, which come first, and the kind of the very basic concept. And German was the language in which I was studying. So basically, I developed much more, finer intellectual distinctions. And then I worked for a while in Switzerland, where, of course, I was confronted with Berndeutsch, so with Bernese version of German, which is very different from standard German. I didn't learn properly to speak it, but at least I learned to understand it so that I could communicate with my patients. And then I moved to Cambridge in late 90s, and English was a language I already had at school, both in Poland and in Germany. But I have to admit that it was always my weakest subject of all. Well, maybe except for with physical education, which was not my strength. English and physical education were always the two things I was dreading most. And maybe, handwork and so, that were the kind of the three. So at the A-level, party, my English teacher told me, you see, I give you a very good advice for life. Try to find yourself a job where you don't need English. So that was the advice of my teacher. But anyway, already, so then of course English became the main language. And then while still living in Cambridge, I met a Spanish woman. We ended up together. We ended up marrying. And I spent a lot of time in Barcelona, where her family is, and my daughter was born in Barcelona. And practically, because I would say my Spanish is pretty good by now, and she doesn't speak any Polish, Spanish became very quickly one of the family language. So it's still the language I speak also with my daughter, who is 10 by now. So here we have already the symmetry. And I think that's an interesting question for kind of overlap between research and private life. So one of the research, strands, which I find very interesting at the moment, is the idea that we make different type of decisions in different languages, more emotional in the first language and more utilitarian in the second. But then the question is, in most cases, the first language is also the one that we learn at home, in family, and so on. The second language is learned, at the university, as I was giving you example of Polish and German. So in a way, the question is, does it have something to do with the order of acquisition, or does it have something to do with the context in which we use the language? And in my case, I have, so to say, the other pair, English and Spanish. I learned Spanish, I would say, after English, so it's the youngest of my four main languages, but very much in a family context. So from this point of view, for me, emotionally, the kind of the two pairings is Polish and Spanish are the emotional languages, and German and English are more the kind of working languages, conceptual languages. So from this point of view, I would be interesting, and that's why I got interested in trying to disentangle this question of the first language versus informal language, because in a way, it can very well be that we learn a language later in life, but not necessarily in professional context. Yes, I gave some talks at Spanish-speaking universities in Spain or in Buenos Aires in Argentina, but I never really lived in Spain. It's not a language I really worked in, but in language where I first learned to speak about, I have to think in English, terms like dummy and nappies and so on. Were first for me acquired in Spanish, because that was the language, so to say, you speak with the baby.
I see. So it's kind of like a very interesting way of thinking about what first language means, really.
Absolutely. I think there is this kind of shortcut, because it's a common situation to equal the first language of the family.
Yes.
And the second language is the language of education. It's the case in many, many situations, but it's not always the case. And I think if we want to understand, for instance, decision-making in language, we need to understand that as well. Because very often it is, the whole argumentation is about the age of education, and one forgets the context of education. We can also acquire, firstly, schooling can start very early. So, in Britain, schooling can start with 4 years, as in my my daughter. So the formal language can be, in fact, very, very early. On the other hand, we can learn languages informally much later in our life. And the classical example is, for instance, if we marry someone speaking a different language or have a partner speaking a different language, raise a child, then, of course, automatically it will become much more an emotional language. So from this view, I think it is, this kind of shortcut of first language and emotion can, as I say, there are other factors which play a role, and it's not that easy to disentangle it, but I would say it's a very important question for research, or should be.
Would you also say that, because there is quite a lot to unpack here, but would you also say, when it comes to this problem of first and second language, that it's not only a problem of the person who speaks these languages, but also of other people in the environment? So I'll give you an example now, that when we started emailing, I was not sure if your first language was Polish. I actually thought that perhaps this is your second language.
Yes. So-called.
And so for me, that was very interesting. It was something that I didn't know about myself, because I simply did not meet too many people speaking Polish as their second language. So I was not in the situation in which I had to really think about what I want to tell you, how I'm going to communicate that. So on one hand, you could understand me, and on the other hand, it will not be too simple, too stiff, that it's not odd and awkward, that it's still like a normal message that I would send to someone, and not too simple. So I had to be very strategic about it. And to me, it was interesting that I felt some sort of tension, some sort of like, I didn't want to make you feel like I do not appreciate that you speak Polish. So I didn't want to respond in English, but I also wanted to make sure that it's not, I don't patronize you and I don't speak too simple of a Polish, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's, again, to make a complicated issue more complicated again, you're absolutely right. Here come a lot of other factors. So maybe that's a good occasion for me to introduce the fifth language. And Portuguese. I really like Portuguese. I traveled a lot, both in Portugal and in Brazil. And this year, maybe I can start saying that last year I also graduated as a tourist guide for Scotland. So, during the COVID, we could not travel very much. So I thought, how can I use the time without conferences and invited talks and so on best? And I thought, learning to become a guide for Scotland would be a very good idea. And I graduated year after the 2 years course, doing a course, or my exam in English, Polish, Spanish, and German. Here I added to it Portuguese. I really love the language, although it's more difficult than Spanish, and I always have to concentrate to kind of suppress my Spanish words coming to my mind in order to access the Portuguese ones. But that leads me to a kind of interesting idea about the kind of interaction of people in different languages. So there are some languages where basically people expect you to speak. That, for instance, English. I would say to a certain degree it could be French. Some occasions it could be, let's say, Spanish. If you are in Latin America, where basically the assumption is, most people will know it. Then you have languages where people appreciate if you learn them, because not many people learn them, but some do. And I would say Portuguese would fall into this category, like Italian. So in a way, I would say Portuguese and Italian speakers very much appreciate if you make an effort to learn the language, because it's not something self-evident, but they have also experienced that they are foreigners doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have languages, and I would put Polish into this category, although it's spoken by quite a large number of people, where in a way the assumption is no foreigner will ever learn it. And in fact, in Poland, we have even an assumption no foreigner will ever be able to learn it. So I know several scholars of Polish history, some of them, well, in fact, with different first languages, English, German, but also Hungarian. And the Hungarian was the professor of Polish literature in Cambridge, Gomory, a specialist on Norwid, which is not the easiest poetry in Polish, as you will know. But, his first language was native language was Hungarian. So people are very surprised. So you have this kind of the idea, well, we are such a kind of small language group, and our language is so difficult. You kind of don't assume that someone who doesn't have it as a first language will ever be able to have a conversation, which is difficult because it can discourage people from learning that language. So in a way, for instance, one of the things I'm trying to fight for at the moment is that Polish should be one of the languages taught at schools in Scotland. It is taught at some schools in England, but ironically not in Scotland. Let's say you can do your GCSE, or let's say it would be the Scottish equivalent of them in Urdu, but not in Polish. And I think it would be very important. So in a way, for outside, I try always to explain why it is possible and useful and so on. So, but I think it's a little bit, the fault from within the Polish community with this assumption never learn it.
That's I agree. It is something that, it's our tale that we keep telling ourselves.
Exactly.
Coming back actually to English, because you started talking about it, and that there is an assumption that, people have to kind of speak English. And in the academic context, I would say that to communicate our work and to collaborate with people, we bound to use English. And can you tell me what kind of pros and cons do you see here? Like, do you see this as a restriction or actually something that brings us closer? What's your take on that?
Well, both. A very good question. I think my answer is a clear both. You see, here in German, you have a very nice answer, namely Jein. So the German word for yes is ja, the German word for no is nein, and then you have this kind of answer Jein, which means, well, it's a yes and a no.
I love it. I'm stealing this.
Which I think, and this question for me is a very, very decisive Jein. So the need for a certain lingua franca is very old as humanity. And in fact, even if you look at societies, let's say, which do not have, formal education and so, or let's say, schools, if you look even at hunter-gatherer societies or early agricultural societies, very often you will have languages that are spoken as a kind of lingua franca across big areas. Let's say Fulani or Pearl in West Africa, for instance, would be an example. And then, of course, it became even stronger where you had, administration. So let's say Aramaic in Persian Empire, of course, in the Western, so to say, or in Western Europe, it was Latin for, a millennium at least, if not more. In Islamic, where it would have been Arabic, and so on and so on. So in a way, it would be for a long time Persian, for instance, in India, before English even became the language. So in a way, I see the usefulness of having a language that many people speak. But on the other hand, of course, it has problems in that, particularly if this is perceived as a scholarly language, it kind of pushes all other languages into a situation where linguists speak about diglossia, where basically you have a kind of high prestige, sophisticated language. and the language in which basically you buy meat and vegetables at the market. And that would have been the situation often in Europe before the Renaissance brought literature and so on in our national languages. And in some way, I would say I fear that we are going back to kind of middle ages in this respect, that many people find it difficult to, whatever their first language, to have a conversation, for instance, about, let's say, their PhD in a language in English. And there are studies on that. I remember many years ago, well, not that many, but several years ago, I heard a study from the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences, which suggests that the majority of Dutch students found it very difficult to speak about their, PhD students, to speak about their PhD in Dutch, although it was their native language and they were studying in Netherlands. So it's even stronger, of course, let's say, for people like us who live and work in British academia. Yes. But I would say it can be even a problem if you stay in your country. So there were Dutch students doing PhDs at Dutch universities, and yet they found it difficult to speak in Dutch about their topics.
Wow.
So from this point of view, I think there is a danger of relegating the other languages. And the danger is because English is, well, let's say, I wouldn't say, if I had to choose a language for international communication, I don't think English would have been my first choice. It has incredibly complex and difficult pronunciation for most non-native speakers, probably one of the most difficult in Europe of European languages. It has a, dramatically unpredictable and irregular spelling.
True.
And in addition, I wouldn't say it's a terribly precise language. So I would say, for instance, I find German much more precise to express, scientific or very, very precise ideas. So from this point of view, there are not any linguistic reasons that made English so strong. It's basically first the British Empire and then very much the technological and political dominance of the United States as an English-speaking country kind of decided it. So from this point of view, I think if we leave out all other languages, we leave out all the different ways of thinking, of classifying things, of understanding things, which in English cannot really be expressed that way. And I have many examples of that. That kind of links to what I said, for instance, about emotional languages, Polish and Spanish. Now, Polish and Spanish has a lot of expressions, like basically, our famous linguist and our country woman, Anna Wierzbicka, was speaking about the experiential structures. She works in Australia. Has been working there for many years. But structures, something is happening. For instance, zapomniało mi się in Polish. Spanish, you can say se me ha olvidado. It doesn't really translate well in English. It's something that happens to us. So it means that you are kind of passive recipient. Or umarła mu matka. Me o le ha muerto la madre. You can say very similar in Spanish, but it doesn't really make sense in English. But for instance, Russian is full of these expressions. Hindi is full of these expressions. In Hindi, so things always happen to us. And this is something which is very difficult to explain to an English speaker. So if you know any other language, let's say if you know Polish or Spanish or Hindi and so on, you can immediately understand what happened. For me, the best example is if, let's say in Poland, we come too late to the station and the train is gone, you would say uciekł mi pociąg. So the train ran away from me, which, it's very different and very strange.
Yes. In a way, yes.
Say it would be perfectly understandable to a Spanish or Hindi speaker, so or a Russian speaker, and so on. So from this point of view, I think it's if we practically reduce all our ways of thinking, feeling, seeing the world, and so on to one language, we are robbing ourselves of an incredible richness. It's a little if we move from a color world to a black and white. I mean, you can be very precise in black and white, but I would still say that you lose a lot of finer details if you leave out color of this world. So for me, a kind of monolingual world is very much a kind of a world in black and white.
And don't you also think that it also has an impact on people who both on the relationship, kind of the way they talk to each other, on people who both speak English and they have one different mother tongue? So I'll give you an example right now that, again, to me it's very interesting because this is the first time it really happened to me, that I, at some point, at first I didn't know that you speak English. Later I learned that you do speak English. Polish. That you do speak Polish. That this is your mother tongue. And then I was in a pickle because I wasn't sure how am I supposed to address you. Because in English, I address you per Thomas and per you. In Polish, it's very rude, and I would never do it. But at the same time, my English kind of brain overlapped over my Polish brain, and I was very, very confused, if that makes sense. So do you think there could be also like some sort of tension?
Oh, definitely. I mean, names are a very interesting topic in itself. So starting with my name, whether I would present myself as, Thomas Bach or Tomasz Bąk. So my family name, as you pronounce correctly, is Bąk, but of course it's an A with this kind of small wiggle below, which any other language has. I mean, the sound on does exist, although it's not very common. You will find in Portuguese or in French, so they will have no problem pronouncing it, but you will find it more difficult in most other European languages. And that's why when I moved with 17 to Germany, I already kind of moved the pronunciation to Bach. But I would say what is even more interesting is, of course, the Christian name, the given name, because, as you will know, in Polish, every person will have quite a variety of names. So let's say I am Tomasz, I would be Tomek for my friends and kind of in informal conversation, and I would be Tomuś or Tomeczek for my parents or maybe my partner and so on. So in a way, we are used to different forms, and it's not just about the people, it's also about situations. So I would know, for instance, if my father would say to me, Tomaszu, so vocative comes also, that then I know either he was angry with me or he wanted to impart something really important. Tomaszu, I will tell you now something you should remember for all your life. So in a way, you can have within the same people having different forms. And I have it with my daughter. Her name is Alba. But, it lends itself to many Polish diminutives, Albunia, Albusia, Albusieńka, Albunieczka, and so on. But now she's 10, becoming a teenager, so she doesn't like it because it sounds kind of childish. So what she accepts is if I called her Albuś, because that's already, it's still a diminutive, but it doesn't quite have the same childlike sweetness. So in fact, Albuś is quite a good address. I hope you will agree for.
Yes, I do.
And you see, any Polish native speaker will have, so to say, this whole field of names. And when I moved to Germany, I found it very strange that people just had one pronunciation of the name. So the name was about their identity. So you had, for instance, let's say a lot of names in German are different forms of Anna. So you have Anke, Anya, entier, and so on. And then, but that is the correct form of the name. You would not really use it. And if you come to Britain, it's even less so. And if anything, you have this kind of shortened version. That is again something which I find emotionally very strange, because in Poland, I would say, the more you love someone, the longer the name becomes. I would say, Alba, Albusia, Albusieńka. So in a way, whereas in English, the more you love someone, the shorter the name becomes. Again, Spanish is very much like Polish. I would say Albita. So again, so the diminutives are usually longer, which I would say, if I love someone, I can spend a couple of milliseconds to add a syllable. So for me, the idea of shortening the word, basically, there is something really, it puts me off. And that is something kind of emotional, where, as I say again, I mean, even in German, you would usually add something in diminutive. So this kind of English diminutives getting everything to kind of into one syllable, I perceive as very, I don't know. I mean, in a way, not just casual, but kind of careless. It's like, I don't really care about you.
You should put effort into it.
Exactly. I don't put any effort. I will just, say it as fast as possible because I don't really care. So from this point of view, I think, names in itself, I mean, it's a whole, wonderful topic, because, as I say, you use in a language or linguistic culture like Polish and many, Slavonic languages, but many others as well, you will use different forms, not only with different people, but even with the same person, you might use different forms depending on the situation, and so on and so on. And then, of course, there comes an additional issue of using or having the choice between polite and direct form, which practically all European languages I know have, except English. So in a way, English is, in the strange situation that you say you basically use polite form to everybody, with one single exception. So you can use the impolite form to God, which I find quite interesting. Because that's what you say, our Father, thou art in heaven. That is the original informal form. So so to God you can be impolite, but to all other people you have to be polite. So that's a kind of interesting thing about English. So in a way, in English, you don't really have to think about the way of addressing people, because it's you, whoever you speak with. But of course, in Polish, German, Spanish, and so on, you have to think, will I use the form pan or will I use the form ty? And every language which have slightly different boundaries.
I have one, and I think last question. One of your scientific interests is the relationship between brain and language. And I remember from your talk called Cognitive Effects of Language Learning, which I highly recommend everyone to watch. You basically named monolingualism as a health condition. And I think it really gives perspective on how we could, or perhaps should, look at it. And can you actually explain us now the effects that monolingualism causes and why we should do something about it?
Well, thank you very much for mentioning it, because I think it's an important issue. And in a way, I have to say, mea culpa, I also belong to people who publish papers on the impact of bilingualism on, and so on and so on. But if we do it, we kind of assume that the normal situation of human individuum, mind, brain, and society is to be monolingual. And then you have some weirdos who speak more than one language. But if you look at it from an evolutionary point of view, it's highly likely that language developed in highly multilingual situations. There is, if you look, for instance, still surviving hunter-gatherer societies or early agricultural societies, they are usually highly multilingual. with the exception of those that are isolated, let's say in a desert or on an island and so on. In fact, in many civilizations, you have something called linguistic exogamy, in which is a taboo to marry someone speaking the same language because they are likely to have the same pool. If you have, let's say, 1,000 speakers of a language, then probably they will be also quite closely related genetically. So from this point of view, I would say multilingualism has been a norm rather than exception, and it is still probably in most countries of the world. So we are kind of projecting the highly unnatural situation in the Anglosphere in some other nation states, relatively modern nation states, of a kind of homogeneous one language society. And from this point of view, if we find 4 years difference, as for instance I found in my work, between the presentation of dementia in bilinguals and monolinguals, the objective finding is there is an interval of about 4 years. The bilinguals develop dementia later than monolinguals. But
that's huge.
How you interpret it or how you formulate it, here language comes in. You could say bilingualism delays the onset of dementia, but you could also say monolingualism accelerates the onset of dementia. Equally, let's say, if we know that, high blood pressure increases the risk of stroke and so on, you could say high blood pressure is a risk factor, or you could say low to normal blood pressure is a preserving factor. So from this point of view, it depends simply which kind of view we have. And I am trying to put myself more and more into the frame of mind of speaking about the monolingualism as a strange condition and multilingualism being the default. So basically, I would say our brains, there is no such thing as a multilingual brain. The brain is open to learn many languages. But I would say in situation of linguistic deprivation, in which there is only input in one language, people develop only one language. So that's how I would see it. But as I say, it's the question of default. And the same with stroke. Let's say, if I think about other studies where we showed that basically over 40% of bilinguals after 1 year roughly recover their cognitive functions, but less than 20% of monolinguals. Here again, you could say bilingualism is a protective factor, a factor which accelerates, in this case, the cognitive recovery, or you could say monolingualism is the factor that delays the recovery. So the point is, if there is a difference, what you define as rule and what you define as exception depends on your point of view. And I think because so much research is being done in the Anglosphere, in America and UK, which interestingly are highly multilingual countries, we have here two native Polish speakers having this debate, both based in UK, having this debate in English, but the official ideology is monolingual. The reality is not. I mean, in states, of course, you have, there are probably more speakers of Spanish in the United States than there are in Spain. But the official ideology is monolingual, and therefore, so the reason why monolingualism is seen as default is not a scientific one, it's an ideological one, it's a political one. And that is something where I try to kind of provoke people into thinking. I think, I like provoking thinking in many respects. So, for instance, later today, I have a tour of Edinburgh for, group which comes from a multilingualism grant, international grant, about languages of Scotland, from Pictish to Polish. And and one of the questions I want to raise is, what is indigenous language? How do we define indigenous language? So from this point of view, I think I use it to make people think about what we use as our default settings, because a lot of research depends on these default settings.
I think it's a very lovely way of finishing our fascinating discussion. Narrative is very important, and as you say, perhaps monolingualism should not be the norm.
Yeah, or at least if I can interrupt, I think that we should make people, multilingualism should not be perceived as something strange and abnormal, and we should increase the opportunities for people to be exposed to different languages. Whether they pick them up or not is a different question, but I think it should be, I would almost say, is our human linguistic right to be able to be exposed to different languages.
Wow, that was powerful. That this is a human right. I agree. So thank you so much for this conversation. This was SciLang Global Podcast. Till the next time.